So we're live.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Nadia, and this is Julia, and we're here today with Tom Preston-Werner, who is the co-founder and CEO of GitHub, or past CEO of GitHub, and then the current founder and CEO of Chatterbug. So yeah, if you want to get into that more, just to start, talk about how you got to where you are today, especially with starting Chatterbug.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in Iowa. I went all the way through high school in Iowa. I moved out to California for college, did a couple of years of college, dropped out, worked for some startups, worked for myself, moved to San Francisco, co-founded GitHub and ran that for a number of years. And then I've worked on Chatterbug most recently. And I'm actually chief product officer there, not CEO. Well, I co-founded GitHub with a guy named Scott Chacon. He's actually the CEO of Chatterbug. And so we're working together again, which is really great. So that was about 4 or 5 years ago now. So I'm mostly a developer, designer, largely self-taught, though I did take a number of computer science classes in college, though I thought I was going to be more of a physics major. I actually was majoring in physics when I was in college. For the first year, I switched to computer science when I realized that physics is just math. But I'll say that I really, really wanted to go to MIT. So it feels very special to be speaking to you that made it to MIT. I went to a school called Harvey Mudd, which you probably all have heard of. Most people have not, but yeah, Harvey Mudd was great. I was there for 2 years. But yeah, MIT, Caltech, and Harvey Mudd were my three, the three that I was focusing on when I was applying to colleges. So it's very cool to be speaking to students of MIT.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you here today. Could you tell us more about how Chatterbug is set apart from other language learning platforms such as Duolingo and other products like that?
Sure. Sorry, my internet cut out there for 1 second. Would you mind? I'm going to try to switch to a different Wi-Fi. I've now deleted this other Wi-Fi endpoint 5 times, and it's haunting me. It keeps coming back.
Oh, no.
But this experience will be better if I switch to this other one. So
Okay.
I'll answer your question in 1 second. I might drop off for a second, but I'll be right back. Promise.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay, should be back. Chatterbug, so the way that we differentiate is that Chatterbug, if you want to learn a foreign language, you have a lot of ways to do it. There's really 3 major ways that you might do it. You might try to do it by using just applications like mobile apps or online digital learning, things like Duolingo or Babbel that are primarily just you and the computer, you and your phone. The problem with those is that you're not really speaking very much. And what we found is that you get good at the things that you practice. So if you don't practice speaking another language, then it is nearly impossible that you would ever get good at actually speaking a language for real, right? So you never reach fluency. You might know some words, you might know some grammar, you might know some things sort of academically or intellectually, but fluency will always be out of reach in those scenarios. So the other way that you could do it is by doing just in-person tutoring or going to some kind of a class, really. And you could do that. You could do an in-person class, and those can actually be effective if you go consistently because you're practicing speaking, and that's the main thing, right? You're learning, you're in an environment where you can learn, you're practicing speaking. Another way you could do it, there's a bunch of online tools that will do matchmaking and essentially pair you with a tutor, things like italki. And these are good for speaking. You do a lot of speaking. The problem is that they generally don't offer any curriculum to go along with it. So you've got to come up with your own curriculum. You're digging through looking for books and applications that are going to help you do the efficient part of the learning, onboarding words, doing flashcards, all of these things you're off on your own looking for other tools. But you might actually learn to speak the language because you're practicing speaking the language. But it's much less efficient than it could be. It's also quite expensive. And so Chatterbug, we pair those 2 things. So it's both the self-study that you would do, the Duolingo or Babbel style. We have all the curriculum that we built ourselves. But we also have 45-minute live sessions that you do over the internet with fluent speakers of your target language. And the intended course is that you would kind of go back and forth between these two things. So you do some self-study, you're learning words, you're learning grammar, you're watching videos, you're doing some writing practice, listening, all of these things you can do on your own. And you're not paying for that at the same rate that you're paying for a human's time. But when it comes time to do we call them live lessons, then those are the more expensive parts. We base pricing primarily based on these live sessions. And those are more expensive, right? But you can get more out of them if you just spend the time doing the study local. But we know everything about you if you're using Chatterbug, all of the online learning that you're doing, we know all about it so that we can bring that learning to the live experience. So it's really just trying to bring technology, bring good design, and good user experience plus efficiency to language learning. So that's kind of our take on it, the best of both worlds.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Looks like it would be really efficient and effective. But have the challenges of 2020, like with COVID-19 and all of that, have they affected like how you think about these things, both like with Chatterbug and maybe in like the developer community with GitHub and like other things that you're working on?
Yeah, it's interesting. So GitHub, we started out not remote at all. We were all in San Francisco to begin with. And until we were about 20 people, we were fully in San Francisco. We had a tech guy in Colorado that we hired because he was already doing that work. Essentially, he was like just doing it for free. And we're like, hey, do you want to just work for us and continue doing what you're doing? And so we knew he was great, but he was remote. We were like, tech support, like that's a role that we think that could work this way. So once we were 20 people, then we started branching out and hiring more people remotely. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to accommodate that. It means that you have to run your company in a way that makes your remote employees feel like they're included. The danger always is that if you have an office, if you have a primary location and you have remote people, that those remote people will feel left out. They'll feel like they have a second class experience. And so that was something we didn't want to have happen. So we worked very hard at GitHub to avoid that. The all hands that we would do every Friday, we always streamed them live. We had ways for people to give feedback and incorporate that into the all hands meetings. They were always recorded. So if you missed it or, we did them on Fridays. So it would be unfortunate timing for some people that were in maybe Europe where it starts to get really late and they don't really want to be watching the all hands late on a Friday. And so we always recorded them and made them available. And just did a lot of things. We flew people into San Francisco fairly often to have what we called mini summits, which were kind of team groups getting together. We used to do 2, but we switched to 1 full company summits per year. Once we were like 150 or nearly 200 people, we switched to once a year because they're fantastically expensive to fly everyone to the same location. That all is to say that those were interesting lessons to be learned. And with Chatterbug, it's a little bit different. We started it in San Francisco. The 4 founders are all from San Francisco. But then we started building it out in Berlin because we started with a German curriculum and we thought it would be cool to launch it in Berlin because there's a lot of expats. And so there's a lot of people in Berlin and Germany that want to learn German, which is kind of funny, right? But there's such an international community there. A lot of people have moved there for work and because Germany is awesome. And so we thought that would be a fertile market there. So we started advertising there, and then we found a couple of good people that we hired there. And your money goes a lot further there than it does in San Francisco. I mean, that's true of almost anywhere, really, right? But it's especially true in Berlin. And there's amazing people, and we can provide them a really good quality of life there for less money than we could do it in San Francisco. And so we started hiring more people. We just kept finding great people there. We were able to hire curriculum developers and pay them really well there, which we could never do in San Francisco. And there would be no curriculum developers to be found in San Francisco. It's just too expensive to live here. And so we just found great success starting to build the company out there. So now the company is mostly built there. We have about 40 people. And I'm still in California. 2 of the other founders that are in California, Scott actually now lives most of the time in Berlin. He kind of moved over there. And so that's a different situation. Now we have the primary office is essentially in Berlin, And then you've got a couple of the founders who are remote, which has its own set of challenges from a management perspective. And then a couple of other people that are remote. But this is to say it makes us really resilient to things like a pandemic, because there was basically no disruption in how we worked, because we already were doing things mostly online. We always, in both in the GitHub scenario and also in the Chatterbug scenario, we leverage online tools. We always did our all hands through Zoom, because what I've found to be true is, if you're doing a meeting, if any person in that meeting is remote, it's much better if everyone is remote. The worst possible experience, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, is you've got like 4 or 5 people in a room all together, and then you're like trying to call in, and it's just a nightmare. It's just the worst. You're like, but I get, like you can't get a word in, and everyone's trying to accommodate, but they hate it because, you're like screwing up their the flow they have, and it's terrible, right? So it's way better if anyone is remote, that everybody is remote. But that's always how we tended to work. So really the disruption for us has been quite minimal, and I would expect for GitHub that it has been pretty minimal as well.
It seems like you've gotten like pretty efficient at building startups by now. I know that you've talked about building Gravatar in the past, and how building that has taught you a lot that you took into GitHub and Chatterbug. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, Gravatar was really my first foray into something that really got some attention. So I worked for some startups. I did Java programming, and then I got more into web development. I got into web standards, started building more websites, HTML, CSS, tried to do it in the modern way, which, this was like 2003. So I don't know what you all were doing in 2003, but I was just getting into web standards at the time. It was a very different world, and I loved it. And I wanted to do more. That's where I started learning design, so that I could do all the design work myself as well. And blogs were starting to be a thing. They weren't like this. This was the early 2000s was when weblogs really started to become popular, and you started to have people that ran really popular weblogs, and there were big communities of bloggers that started to come about. And I thought that was great. I started writing my own blogs, experimented with a bunch of the weblogging frameworks, and started building some plugins. And I just wanted to make a dent in that. I wanted to matter. I wanted to do something that like anyone cared about. And so I spent a lot of time. This is when I was working for myself, doing consulting, kind of just building web pages for people and doing picking up whatever jobs I could, which I was not very good at because I didn't know anybody back then. I wasn't really connected into the world of this type of work. So it was a real struggle. So I had some extra time, and I would wake up in the morning and I would stare at the ceiling, which it had this like popcorn texture. I don't know if you're familiar, like they used to spray this stuff on the ceiling for, I guess, acoustics. Horrible stuff. But you would have like patterns. It's like staring at clouds, right? Like you can start to like see patterns and stuff. But I remember I'd stare at that ceiling for like a half an hour after I woke up. You wake up kind of groggy, like you don't have to get out. I'm working for myself. Like I didn't have to do it. I didn't have to do anything. I did if I wanted to make money, but mostly I wanted to just build something that like people cared about. And so I'd stare at the ceiling and I'd try to think of ideas. And eventually I had this idea where it was like, there's all these blogs out there and they all have comments and you can comment on them, which people did a lot. But everyone you go to, you have to it's like its own little universe. None of them are tied together. And they would have avatars, but you'd have to upload your picture to every single one separately, which I thought was annoying. So the idea was, what if you could create a service where you know people's emails, because you would always put your email address in back then in these weblogs. When you commented, you put your name and your email address in your comment. So they all had your email address. And the idea was, well, if they all have your email address, they could use that to look up your avatar. And then they would just have your avatar and it would be everywhere. And everyone could do it and none of them would have to coordinate. It would just be a lookup from your email to your avatar. And so I started building that out, and I just, you don't want to just put your email as the thing that you're looking up. So I added you would hash it, used an MD5 hash to just, so that when it was on the page, because this would be the URL, right? Your email would essentially be in the URL, but you want to put your plain text email in the URL. And so you one-way hash it with an MD5 hash. And that's what you would then use to look up the avatar. And I was like, okay, this is easy enough. I can do this. I wrote it in PHP, was I think what I was using at the time. Or PHP had at the time the best image processing software in it that was really easy to use. So I wrote it in that. It was quite inefficient. Took a lot of pride. It would dynamically real time. Every time you made a request, get the image and then resize it, because in Gravatar you could specify what size you wanted the avatar, and it would actually resize it for you. And so I whipped it up, and I used it on my blog, and I wrote to a couple other people that were bloggers, and I was like, hey, I wrote this thing. It's called Gravatar. You should check it out. And a few of them did, and a few of them used it, and a few of them wrote about it, and then it just started to get more popular from there. And it was awesome. It was a really good feeling to have an idea that like stuck and that people went with. The problem with Gravatar was that it had no business model. And so when it became more popular, it became more expensive to run. And then it became very stressful to run because I didn't have any money. I was in a bunch of credit card debt. And yet I was paying like $300 or $400 a month in server costs to run this thing. So then I rewrote it to be more efficient using light TTPD, which was a cool web server back then, and some Lua code that would do the resizing and whatnot. More, I pre-rendered every single image. So every avatar that came in, I rendered from 1 by 1 pixel to 80 by 80, which was the max size back then. And it was a cool process, but also very stressful, because it then became not very in the time when I was redoing it, it became unstable, and people really didn't like when their avatars were all broken all over their blogs, and they started writing mean and nasty things to me, and that was that was not awesome, right? So this is another thing that you learn, which is if you create something that's popular and then you struggle with trying to keep it performant, then you get into this other side of things, which is more notoriety for having built something that people want but they can't get, right? Now that's a different thing that you have to be prepared. And you saw this with Twitter in the early days too, right? The fail whale, they had a lot of trouble scaling it because it's a hard thing to scale. And then people would freak out and say really mean things about Twitter. So there were many lessons to be learned there. But I definitely learned that if you build something and it becomes popular, you should probably have a way to make money from it so that you can run it without it becoming, right? You need resources to put into it so that you're not just carrying this huge burden on your shoulders with no way to escape. So that's why GitHub, which I also started as a side project, had that from the beginning. When I was coming up with ideas, the idea that I wanted to come up with, I wanted to make sure it had a plausible business model. And GitHub seemed like it would, right? It's like if people want to use this, then they can pay to host their repositories, right? Like that's built in.
Yeah, that's awesome. And obviously now you have a lot more resources, and so you can give back to the community that you originally started out from. And so we saw that recently you donated to San Francisco's COVID-19 response and also the racial justice movements. So do you have any tips or advice that you can give to our hackers about maybe how they can use their technical skills to become more involved in that movement? Maybe even if they don't have the same financial resources, but they still want to make an impact in that sphere?
Yeah, I'd say there's always opportunities to give back, regardless of how much money you have or what your skill set is. There's always something. And giving back can mean a lot of different things to different people, right? You want to probably pick something that speaks to you, something that makes sense. And there's a lot of local things too, right? Really, it's just about finding something that you think you can make an impact in and just go do that thing, right? Like the biggest barrier is it's not money or time or skill. It's just the activation energy to get off of your couch and go do it, right? So I think my biggest suggestion would be stop convincing yourself that like now is not the right time to do it, and just take that step, right? Like go to that meetup where people are talking about it. Like if you're into politics, go find the candidate you want to support and start being on the phone banks to start calling people. You know, if it's like local cleanup at a park or a beach or something, like that's all of these things are necessary. They're all giving back. But we as technology people, as developers and designers and people that know how to use technology, we have an even bigger opportunity because we can use those skills to make bigger impact. So that becomes a little bit tricky because it's like, okay, well, I know how to code, so where do I contribute my skills of code to volunteer? And that can be tricky. I wish that I could give you like an organization that I could just point you to that would like help you figure that out. It really depends on what you're into. Like there's various things for politics. So there's Code for America, which is a really cool organization. I know the founder there, and they've done a lot of really great work around making it like it's like civil engagement. It's like, how do we make the government better, the government services better using technology? So there's people building websites to help people that are recently coming out of prison get like find jobs or get the benefits that they possibly could get in those scenarios, or people that are in low income families get signed up for food stamps because the government doesn't make that a particularly easy process. Or they've done things around adopting like fire hydrants or something. So it's like, all right, when it snows a lot, you still want the fire hydrants to be accessible, but the government, the state and city, county governments don't really have programs to do that. So they built some website where they list all the fire hydrants, and like you can sign up to be like, oh, when it snows, I'm going to go dig out this fire hydrant, right? So like these are cool things that we can do when you know how to build a website. Then you can be like, well, I can overlay, if I have a list of all the hydrants and their GPS locations, and I could put those on a Google map, and I could let someone click on it and say that they want to, right? So these things are skills that we can have that can make a real impact. So that's one from a sort of a civil engagement perspective. I don't know. It's you. If you go look for them, you will find them. It's just a matter of like what gets you excited. Like what makes you want to get off your couch and do that instead of watching TV.
Yeah, that's some like super critical advice. I think like I personally like forget that like you're like in control of your own actions and like yeah. So one of the hackers was actually asking about startups and like how do you choose what idea that you're going to pursue, and like how do you go through the ideation process?
For me, it's really it starts with frustration. It starts with frustration, a combination of frustration and some concept of what would make it better, some opportunity that's out there. So gravatar wasn't actually a startup. I never incorporated it or anything. When I sold it, I sold it to Automatic, which is Matt Mullenweg, who runs WordPress, and they just wrote me a check personally. So it was never actually a company. So I can't call that a startup, but it was startup-y, I guess, right? It was an idea. I mean, it could, if I had been more savvy and experienced and confident, I probably could have turned it into a startup. I actually did talk to some VCs that had reached out, and they're like, "Hey, are you like raising money for this?" And I'm like, I don't know. I talked to them, and I was just totally unprepared to go down that route. But I think I could have if I had the skills to do it at the time. But so it starts with frustration and seeing a problem. And this is always where opportunities exist, is where problems exist. So as you go about your day, you can think about the things that you find frustrating. Or every time you complain about something, like that's an opportunity to improve it. And any of those opportunities could potentially be startup ideas. So one way to do it is to just write down everything that frustrates you or makes you angry in your day, especially product experiences with products or services, where you're like, why is this so bad? Like, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to do this thing? Right. And for GitHub, there's this really great version control system called Git that not very many people use, but the Linux kernel is using it. And it seems like it has some really great features around branching and merging that Subversion, which was what we were all using before Git. Subversion was terrible at branching and merging, just awful. It was the worst. And it had to be hosted on a server. So if you were offline, you basically couldn't do anything. You had to be connected to the internet to use it. And Git had solutions for those. And so I started playing with it. And it was like, this is amazing, but you can't, like, there's nowhere to host it. There's nowhere to share. Like, the superpower of Git is that you can easily work together on projects, right? And yet there's no actual way to do that, right? Like, why is this hard? Why has nobody made this easy? And so the solution was, well, I'm a web developer and I know how to make websites, and I could write a library that lets, in Ruby, that lets Ruby on Rails talk to just look at the disk and parse out the Git data structures. And I thought that was an interesting problem anyway, to understand like how Git works and like understand the structure of a Git repository, so that I could then read it in Ruby and then expose that via Rails. And that was the whole concept, right? It was very simple. It's like Git hosting, like that was the whole concept. Code hosting, but for Git, right? Like that was it. That's the boom. Put those two things together. That was the whole idea. But it solved that problem, right? It's like, why is it hard to host Git repositories? Like, that's their superpower. Let's make that easier. For Chatterbug, it's learning a language, right? Like, everybody who's ever learned a language using these tools as an adult has hated it. 99.9% of everyone that's tried to learn a language as an adult has used some of these tools and found them to be lacking. And why is that? Certainly there's not anything intrinsic to language learning that would make it impossible to do well. It's just that all the incumbents are doing it wrong. So I mean, you have to be able to at least delude yourself into thinking that you have all the answers, so that you can, you need a certain level of ignorance to even start, right? So for me, ignorance has always been kind of a superpower, where, and you get this anecdote sometimes from people, it's like I don't know what it is, parable maybe, but it's sometimes you need to not know that it's impossible in order to do it. It's like the story of the math student who went into class one day and was late, and they ran in, everyone was already gone, and there were 3 math equations written on the chalkboard, and they're like, crap, and they wrote them down. They're like, because that was the homework, right? They missed the homework. So they write them down and they go home and they're like, man, these problems are like harder than usual. Like, these are really tough problems. But they sat down, and over the course of the next couple of days, whatever, they worked through them, and they're like, oh man, like, all right, here we go. Finally, I got through these. Geez, like that was, I mean, all right, like, all right, here you go. So he gave him back to his professor, and his professor was like, that was not the homework. Those were 3 currently unsolved problems in mathematics. And you just went and like solved all 3 of them, right? And it was because he didn't go into it with any, he or she, I actually don't know who it was, went into it with no expectations that it wasn't possible, right? So there's a tremendous power in attempting something that you don't know is impossible, right? And so this is like fighting conventional wisdom, and why startups can be so powerful, because they often go into these industries that they don't necessarily know super well, and they start applying things to them that the people who have been in those industries for a long time don't think of, because they become jaded in those, they're like, oh, well, people have tried that and it didn't work. But things change over time. Sometimes you can apply old methodologies to current problems, and it's timing, right? It might not have worked back when people tried it before, but now with the way that the world is, where things have changed, that same attempt might actually work. And so it's also interesting to see startups that people have tried before that have essentially failed. Like in the 2000s, when there was the tech boom and bust, there were companies that looked very much like many of the very successful companies today, but they tanked because the timing was wrong. the world wasn't ready for it, or the technology wasn't ready for it, or the internet infrastructure wasn't ready for it. I've gotten off on a tangent here. But for me, it's about finding the frustration. Where's your frustration, right? Identify a problem, think up a solution, and then really deciding to work on it is the hardest part. For me, I don't try to be too intellectual about it. It's mostly, if I can't stop thinking about it, and it might take me like a year to get to that point where I've like thought about something over and over and over, but eventually it's still a good idea. So time can be the test of this. If you have an idea, it's like you write it down or you talk to people about it, and it's like, well, it's not quite, I'm not ready to stop watching TV and start writing code for this yet. Like, it's not interesting enough. But then you keep thinking about it. You keep, it keeps coming up over and over. Like, you can't not think about it, right? So this is a good way to just, what are the ideas that you keep thinking about? If you keep thinking about something for a number of months or years, and you don't see anyone else do it, and it still seems like a good idea, then eventually you'll find the motivation to be like, all right, well, I'm just going to try it. Like, it seems like a good idea. I can't stop thinking about it, so I'm just going to do it. And so the open source things that I've worked on are more like that. So things like Jekyll. Well, maybe Jekyll wasn't too much like that. The static site generator. Toml was definitely like that. Toml's a configuration language that I wrote that I'd been threatening to write for years. And I sat down one time. My wife was off on the business trip or something, and I was at home alone and drinking some beers. And I was like, all right, I'm just gonna write it. So I spent like an hour and I wrote down the first version of it, and I put it out there, and a lot of people really liked it, right? Like, so this was an idea that I kept thinking I should do. I didn't, do we really need another configuration language? It's questionable, but like all of the existing solutions were terrible. YAML's terrible, JSON's terrible for configuration files. There is no INI files are not standardized. So it was just all of the existing solutions were terrible. And like, I don't know, why not? Why not give it a try? And so that's part of it too, is, I don't know, what harm is there in trying and putting it out there and seeing what happens?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think it's super good advice that you never know unless you try, pretty much. And then going off of that vein of like open source, we have another question from a hacker that's, they say that they want to be more involved in web dev open source, but the community seems really intimidating and overwhelming. And so they're wondering if you have any advice on sort of getting started with that. And that actually intersects with a lot of the stuff we do at HackMIT, because a lot of our software is open source, and we're really passionate about contributing to that community as well.
Yeah, I think everyone, like, there's always this fear of contributing, the fear of like screwing it up or not being smart enough, or, there's a million different things that you could convince yourself are too scary to try. But I think if you go in and you just engage, 99% of the time, people are going to be really helpful, because you're helping out, right? Like, as long as you're thoughtful and you do a little bit of homework and try to figure it out, something out on your own, and dig into it and get somewhere, then you're already ahead of basically everyone else on the planet when it comes to contributing to that thing. And so if the core team of that open source project see that you legitimately care and legitimately want to help, I would be extremely surprised if you had a negative experience at that point. I've run, I have a bunch of open source projects. I've led a bunch of them. And for me, that's always the case. It's like someone comes in and they want to help. You're like, thank you. Yes. Like, please do help. Like, I'm on my own here. People always need more help. Right. So I'd say, again, it's just, go for it. If in the small scenario where it goes badly, which is unlikely, the worst thing is that you were like, okay, well, I guess they didn't want my help, so I'll go take my help somewhere else. Thank you very much, right? And then you go try somewhere else, and the likelihood of having a bad experience twice is probably fantastically low. So definitely, open source is a really powerful thing. If you have the time to do it and the inclination to do it, then I highly recommend it. It's just, it's a way to really work on things that interest you. Because once you get into the workforce and you're working for someone, it's kind of different, right? It's like we all love to write code. If you're a developer and you're doing this, it's quite likely that you actually enjoy writing code, which is awesome. But every day writing code that someone else tells you to write is less awesome than writing the code that you want to write. And so open source is a chance to really reclaim that love of coding in a way that you have complete control. And so the thing for me though is that I very rarely contribute to other people's open source code because that's never really, I don't know. That's never really been super interesting to me. I like writing my own code because again, like if you're working on someone else's project, if you're not in total control, then that's just another scenario where you're not. And I'm not saying that that's bad. Like there are many scenarios in which case, in which you can learn a lot that way, right? So especially as you're starting out, you can learn from the people that are running projects. You can also learn from people how not to run a project. So that's also could be very helpful. Why would you do it that way, right? And then you become frustrated enough and you're like, okay, well, I don't like the way you're doing this. This is ridiculous. And then you go and write your own. So I always encourage people to just write something. It can be almost anything. Like you could write something that has been written a million times. Like that's what I do, right? It's not like there were no static site generators when I wrote Jekyll. It's not like there were no configuration formats when I wrote Toml. It's not like there were no web frameworks when I started writing Redwood. Like all of the things that I do, things exist before. Like that's not the hurdle, right? Like it's about the quality of what you create. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. And you can see this over and over from Apple. Like Apple also is in the business of just doing the same thing that everyone else has done. They just do it so much better that then they just blow the competition away. Like the iPhone, right? The iPhone came out, it was like there were zillions of cell phones. But as soon as the iPhone came out, every other cell phone was garbage, right? So it's not about not doing, and this is the same for ideas. Like the ideas that you have that can be successful don't have to be like, oh, I'm going to create this thing that nobody has ever thought of before. Like that's not really how the world works. It's very difficult to think of ideas that you could categorize in that fashion. Super hard. And in fact, those ideas are probably doomed to failure because if nobody has ever thought of them, then, or anything like them, right? Then it's like, is it actually useful? Like you want some element that's new, right? So for GitHub, it was a bunch of people had done code hosting, SourceForge was a thing, Google Code was a thing. If any of you have ever even heard of them. But like there was lots of code hosting sites. It was just, how do you do this better? Right. And we found a technology and we built it in a way that was so much better that those things ceased to exist. Right. And so that's a powerful way to do it, is to just say, how can we do this existing thing or take these two pieces that people haven't combined and do them better? There's this really good book called Where Do Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson. And in it, he talks about this concept of the adjacent possible. The adjacent possible is kind of a theory around this idea that new things that are invented are often not, like when someone creates something new, there's usually multiple, it happens like simultaneously that there's multiple of these things at the same time. So think calculus, for instance. I mean, this phenomenon has always existed. Calculus was basically invented independently by two people in two completely different places in the world at the same time. They used different notation, but it was invented at the same time. Like, what are the chances of that, right? Like, how that seems ridiculous, unless you think about it as the adjacent possible. And so that is to say, imagine all the knowledge that we currently have, all the things that we know, and think of those things as like a set of interconnected rooms, for instance. And all the things that we know are rooms that have the lights on. And every room has a bunch of doors. most of those doors go to other rooms that already have the lights turned on. Every room is like an idea, a piece of knowledge, something that we know. But these rooms also have doors to rooms where the lights are currently off. And so the adjacent possible is not the room that's like 10 rooms away. Like that's the like truly new mind-blowing idea, is a room that is like 4 doors away, that you have to go through 4 rooms to get to that room, that dark room. Those are really hard to find and often doomed to failure because they don't relate to the things that we already know. It's too big of a jump to get from here to there. But the adjacent possible, the rooms that are adjacent to the rooms that have the lights on, those are the things that when we turn the light on, they just expand a little bit what we know. And they do it in a way that we can understand what that means. So it's often the combining of 2 ideas. So it'd be like a room that can be reached from 2 different rooms. If you combine the things that you know in these 2 rooms and you open the door from each of those rooms into this new room, then that idea becomes really powerful. Like in the case of GitHub, it was code hosting and Git, right? Like those were the 2 rooms that we knew about. We knew about Git. Git's a thing. Git exists. People use Git. It's awesome. We know about code hosting. Code hosting is a thing. A bunch of people do it. It's awesome. But the room that is connected to both of those is the idea of GitHub. And there's other ideas that are adjacent to that. Things that were really important, like namespacing in GitHub was by user first and not by project. So on SourceForge, which was a really popular code host prior to GitHub, if you wanted to create a project, you had to ask them for permission. You had to write them, basically, submit a form and be like, here's the name of my project. May I please host it here? And they had to, and it would take potentially days because their top namespace was the only namespace was the name of the project. And so they didn't want just anyone taking any name, like it had to be worthwhile. And that was another frustration. It's like, why do I have to ask you for permission to put this code up? Like, what if my code is not very important? What if it's just a script and I want to share it? Like, why can I not do that? And so in GitHub, we namespaced by user first so that I could have my user and I could put up whatever crap code on there I wanted. I could put up anything. Didn't have to be important, could be anything, but it would allow me to share much more freely and much more quickly. There were no barriers. It was like remove all barriers. So that's another idea, is like reduce barriers, you know? And so all of these ideas exist. And then there's this one room that is connected to all these other ideas. And that's the idea, right? But it was adjacent. None of those things were particularly novel. It was the combination that was novel. So this is often powerful in how you think. It's like, what are the combinations of things that already exist that could be powerful that we haven't thought of?
Wait, that's a really cool way of thinking of it. But yeah. So there's another question that came in about startups. And this person is wondering, how do you find the perfect co-founder? I know you mentioned Scott Chacon. Let's see his last name.
Chacon.
Sorry.
Chacon. Yeah, Chacon.
Chacon. And you've worked with him on GitHub and Chatterbug. So if you could talk about like that, and yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know that I have a perfect answer for that. The best way to pick a co-founder is to have worked with them before. And obviously this is challenging if you haven't really worked with anyone before, or the right kind of people, or you just haven't ever worked with anyone that you really think is the right kind of person to do that. So with GitHub, it was really, I didn't want to do it by myself. I wanted to do GitHub with other people. And so the first person that I asked to help me with it, Chris Wanstroth, who was big in the Ruby community, he was doing a lot of consulting, and I really liked the work that he did. I really respected the things that he did. He wrote blog posts that people listened to, and I just thought his work was great. And he was into Rails in a way that I wasn't as much. I was a little bit kind of tired of writing Ruby on Rails code. I wanted to write more of the library code. So the code that would let Ruby talk to the Git repository. Like, I was really interested in that and less interested in actually building out the Rails part of the code base. But he was big into Rails. So I asked him if he wanted to help, and he said, yeah, this sounds awesome. So he started helping. But I knew him through the Ruby community in San Francisco, and we went to meetups, and I'd have a beer with him afterwards. So we knew each other kind of casually, but I didn't know him much beyond that. So really it seemed like he seemed like the kind of person I wanted to work with. And I was like, I would love to find a way to work with this person. This could be a way to do it. And like, we didn't know, like, was GitHub going to be a thing? Was it going to work? We had no idea. Could have totally not worked, right? So at the time, the stakes seemed pretty low. It was like, I don't know, let's just try it and see. And then his partner, PJ Hyatt, we brought on because they had been working together kind of in their consultancy. And so it seemed to make sense to bring him on, and he knew how to do billing code, and we needed to add building code. And Chris knew him really well, so we added him. And then Scott came on a little while after that, who we also knew through the meetups, through the Ruby meetups in San Francisco. And he knew Git. So none of us really had much experience with Git, honestly. We're like, I don't know, like we were learning all the intricacies of Git while we were building this thing. So here's another good point, which is you don't have to be an expert in a thing when you start. You can build that knowledge over time. Like if you need to know enough to know something, to know where to go next. Like as long as you know where to go next, then you can get there. And by then, hopefully you know where to go next after that, right? You can take it one step at a time. Like you don't have to be an expert. At the time I was not an expert in Git. When we started Chatterbug, I was not an expert in learning languages. Like you don't have to be to do a startup. That's the beauty of a startup, right? Like there's no one to say you can't try, right? This is the beauty of the economics that we have. There's plenty of flaws with capitalism, but one advantage is you can just go do whatever you want, and no one can tell you that you can't. And money is really the limiting factor, right? Like that can be the thing that stops you. But if you have time and you can spend time, then that's just as good as money, right? Like you don't have to have money if you have time. And that was me in the early days. Like I didn't have no money, but I did have time. And so with those founders, it was kind of, I don't know, we found the people that we thought we needed and kind of went for it and didn't think about it too much. And that worked out, I think, really well. There's always challenges, and you learn things about each other, and it wasn't always rainbows and puppies, but we built GitHub, and that was awesome. But now with Chatterbug, I'm working with Scott again. I'm working with a woman named Liz, who was at GitHub as well, who we hired there for PR. She has a background in linguistics. And then a guy named Russell, who was also at GitHub. So the 4 founders of Chatterbug were all at GitHub. We all worked together before. So this is a much more knowable thing. It's like, I know these people. I know what they're like. I know fundamentally who they are as people and their values. And that reduces the risk a lot. So I've done it both ways. I recommend the latter way if you can do it, but oftentimes like there's just, you don't have those relationships with people in that kind of a way to draw from, in which case I'd say, go with your gut.
I feel like that can be good advice in a lot of situations. But it looks like we're just about running out of time. So to finish up, is there any like parting advice you'd want to give to our hackers, or just anything else that you'd like to add?
What is the general demographic? Like, what are you all developers? Are you robotics people? Give me some sense of what you're mostly interested in.
Yeah, well, so the participants in our hackathon have like a wide variety of interests. This year we have both high school students and college students, and also a lot of beginners too that are maybe just learning web dev and like computer science for the first time. But I think the thing that they all have in common is really just like a passion to both learn and just make cool projects that can have some sort of impact in like whatever field that they are particularly interested in. So yeah.
Then I would say my best advice is to always be learning. Number one, always be curious and always be learning. Like, it's my favorite thing. Learning is my favorite thing. Just learning. I'm always learning something new, always. And it's I think it's the thing that I love the most, is just like finding something that I don't know about that I think is interesting and learning. So right now I'm digging into machine learning and AI, which I honestly am very unskilled at. I know I can speak about it. I know things about it as a layperson, but I really don't know the intricacies of it, right? I've never trained a model. Actually, I have trained a model now. First one I trained a couple days ago. And so, you know, in Jupyter notebooks, like I knew of these things and I could speak about them because I read Hacker News and other technology news things, and I've been steeped in this industry for a long time, so I can speak intelligently about a lot of things that I don't know intimately well. But then there's things that come up and I'm like, I want to know more about this thing. And then you can go buy the book and you sit down and you write some code and you learn that thing. Like it's the best thing in the world to just learn. And I would imagine that many of you are the same way. So never lose that. Like that is the thing that always drives me. So that's one thing. Another thing I would say is go build stuff. Like that really is the path to success. Whatever success means for you in technology, the path there requires building stuff. The more stuff you build, the better you are, because it's iteration, and that is learning itself, is in trying. The best learning happens through practice, right? You get, like I said before, you get good at what you practice. So practice coding, practice building things, but don't just build things for no reason. Build them for a customer, build them for a person, right? Like building technology for the sake of technology can be interesting, but to me, it's not enough. To me, it's the reason that I code at all, the reason that I build is never because I love coding, although I do. The real reason is because I want to build stuff that positively affects people. And that broadens what you have to do to be successful in a big way, because it means that you have to build something that people want, and then you have to make sure that they know about it. So there's other skills involved other than just writing code. So you want to start a business, you have to get people to help you build it. You have to convince people to work with you at some point. You have to advertise it or market it. You have to support the people that do use it. You have to keep building the code. And then if it gets popular, you have to deal with the ramifications of being popular, which can be difficulties in scaling and other things. So there's a million things around. Oh, and you have to make money, right? If you want to be sustainable in building a business, unless you, for some reason, have a giant pile of money, then you have to make money. So all of these things are important. So when you're building something, you can start with just the technology. Like that's cool. That's a good way to start. But always be thinking about like, what is the impact on people? Like, what are you trying to do for people? Technology is great. Sometimes we would prefer not to have to talk to other people, right? I was definitely that way in high school. But like the impact that you can have on the world with technology is impacting people, right? Impacting what people can do, how efficiently they can do it, how easily they can do it. Democratizing people's ability to do things is a really powerful thing. I'd say if you want to do anything in climate, like that is one of the greatest needs that we have right now. Like we're in a bad way when it comes to solving the climate crisis. And so if you're choosing a path in your life right now, I encourage you to look at a path that includes climate ramifications. We need more smart people like all of you working on that. We need more people everywhere, and we're doing it too slowly. So you have no baggage in your lives, hopefully. You have a lot of choices ahead of you. If you can do something in climate, I strongly urge you to do so. But really my advice to all of you is just build stuff relentlessly over and over. That'll get you where you want to go.
I think that's a great message to our hackers. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come speak with us and our hackers. I mean, I learned a lot, and I'm sure our hackers learned a lot too. So yeah, I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I really get a kick out of speaking to groups like yours, and like I said, I'm jealous that you all got to go to MIT and I didn't. So thank you very much.